everybody. Welcome to Church History for Chumps. I'm in a bright mood this afternoon, Chumpcast, and I'll tell you why. Because my name is John Simon, but I'm here with two of my favorite people to step into the booth with. You already know the legend, Mr. Thomas Duell.
What up? Glad to be back with you guys. It's been a few.
Back in the saddle. And then we've got one of our favorite guests. I have to say one of, because my wife is, of course, on the docket as well. But one of our favorite guests, Mr. Ben Lansing. Welcome back, man.
Hey, thank you. So happy to be back. I had so much fun previously on the show, so it's great to be here.
Dude, we've had like some of our favorite episodes that we just because of the conversations we've been able to get into. And I've had like a lot of people tell me like, dang, that episode when we went through the myths of the Council of Nicaea, like people have told me that's like their favorite episode. So,
oh, cool.
You know,
awesome.
Yeah. So you're highly regarded.
I think it's just Nicaea is a great topic. It's one of the best topics possible. So you gave me a good one.
Yeah. And it's always fun when like it's one of those things that has a very opposite kind of impression and like how people tends to understand it versus how it is historically. So yeah, we had some fun with that one. Yeah. And Ben, you've actually stepped into the podcasting world yourself, right?
I have. Yes, I have. I now am hosting the Our Church Speaks podcast. So do get on and subscribe. I'd love to. I mean, definitely listen to Church History for Chumps first, always. But then once your palate has been wet and you're ready for more, like you're hungry for more church history, jump over to Our Church Speaks because we have a good time there. I host it with my friend and also co-author. We wrote a book together last year.
Yes, you did.
And, it's just
it's a good book.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've got it on my bookshelf. I should have brought it so I can bring it into the frame, but you just have to trust me that I really do have it. I'm not lying.
Yes, I make it easy for everybody. Called the book by the same name as I gave the podcast. So the book is also Our Church Speaks. And you can learn more about it at ourchurchspeaks.com. So how much more simple could it be?
Well, dude, I just want to congratulate you on the podcast. I once was told it is the birthright of every millennial male to have a podcast. So congratulations on claiming what is rightfully yours.
Oh, wow. All right.
That's probably true. Yeah.
I heard someone say that Let's Start a Podcast was what 20 years ago was Let's Start a Band. It's just like something everybody wants to do. I mean, but I get it. You know, we all have this deep down, this desire for artistic expression. We just do it through opinions instead of music, which maybe says a lot about our culture. But that's different.
Yeah,
episode.
the podcast, it basically episode by episode, it takes a different saint. So very similar to what you guys do often is we'll take a particular person from church history and really it's inspired by the book. The book does the same thing. I'm an artist, so I've drawn images of all these different saints in the book. And then I've written a short, you might call it a hagiography, or you might call it just a little biography, little story of who this person is. And then my co-author, his name is DJ Murata. He's written a reflection, like a devotional reflection on that particular person. So what we do in the podcast is very much like the book. We talk a little bit about the life of that person and then kind of have some devotional reflection on, okay, this person existed. How can we apply some of the wisdom we may glean from studying them or observing their life to our lives as Christians?
Are you working your way through the saints that are in the book, or are you kind of just bouncing around? How's the format?
Yeah, more or less, we're taking a look at the book. We do break out into different topics, though, sometimes. Like this week, we've actually interviewed Dr. Lanta Davis, who is a scholar of the Christian imagination. So we were talking about Christian art and imagination and how that's formative to our lives as Christians. So we'll sometimes do these little breakout topics as well. So,
cool.
We just kind of do each week whatever seems to come up. So,
well,
you guys host a podcast. You know how it is.
I'll say again what I was
absolutely
letting you know before we started recording, but I feel like it's bittersweet. I'm pretty much am not on Instagram anymore, and that's where I first discovered you in your content, and so I didn't even know that you had a podcast. So I'm excited to learn that today and start digging in, even though it sounds like you pretty much just copied our podcast, but it's okay. We'll just
Thomas.
It was a great format. So jumped right in.
I just love this idea in my mind of Ben finishing the recording for the last episode and just being like, I could do this. I don't need them. I could do this myself. And then he just calls up his buddy. Yeah, what am I doing riding the coattails of these losers? I could do this myself. No. Surely that's not even close to accurate. But I mean, honestly, I think it's great. Here's the thing. I think it's only competition when you assume that there's only room for 1 hour of church history per week.
Right.
When in reality, you got to fill up your day with this kind of stuff. You're getting sanctified out here.
We got 20 centuries to work through, guys. So
yeah, we're not even close to covering even the good stuff.
Yeah, I will say about the Instagram. If you're not on Instagram, you can go to ourchurchspeaks.com, and there's a gallery there of the most recent 50 posts or so. So I did that because, a lot of people aren't on social media, and I wouldn't want them to join social media just to follow my content. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hey, let's get into our topic for today, because we've got a really interesting topic that I have been really wanting to get into for a while. I mean, honestly, we're kind of cheating, because when people think church history, they tend to think the Reformation, because, well, I mean, I'm sure Catholics do that, and then they groan and, I don't know, probably shake their fist at, in whatever direction Martin Luther is to them. But as Protestants, which most of us are who listen to this, I imagine, we tend to think of the Reformation quite a bit. And so the figure that I have been interested to kind of discuss today, who Ben's going to help us walk through a little bit, is the figure of King Charles I, because King Charles is, I don't know, he's going to hold a really interesting role in the kind of ongoing English Reformation, and specifically in the divide that's going to happen. And Ben, you can clarify this, because again, I think you're sharper on this stuff than I am, but a lot of what King Charles did was his life, and especially his martyrdom, was kind of an indicator that even though the church in England had clearly said no to Catholicism, they didn't quite know how they really wanted to express that yet. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I think there were a lot of people in England with different views on which way the church should go. And so as a collective, they weren't agreeing. There was a lot of different parties, and they had very strong opinions. Very divided time. Mm-hmm.
So essentially what we have is, in the 17th century in England, we have, we're a few generations removed from the first kind of kickoff of the Reformation, which of course is going to start in Germany, but it's also going to come around to different parts of Switzerland and the Netherlands and France, of course, and it will come to England. But what we kind of see in England is this kind of feeling of, well, how Catholic do we want to look? Almost like, I don't know. I think that because what we see in England is the formation of what we now consider Anglicanism, which is a very high liturgical, I think if you were some kind of traditional Baptist low church fellow, you would walk into an Anglican church and be like, whoa, this kind of looks pretty Catholic to me. And I think that was the impression that was still being had in England at this time. And so, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe cards on the table. I don't remember if we mentioned this, but I am an ordained Anglican deacon, just so you know.
So this
maybe
is
where
you.
Any biases are there? Yeah. I think this is such a fascinating period of time on so many levels. First of all, it didn't matter really what denomination you were in, unless maybe you were an Anabaptist or a later Anabaptist. So whether you were Lutheran, Presbyterian, Anglican, Roman Catholic, you believed in a merging of church and state. You believed that whatever the government was in the country, that would determine what religion was backed by the king or the queen. And also, that king or queen's job, they saw, was to impose their religion on everyone. So everybody, for centuries, had taken that kind of as a given. So what we're seeing, though, in this period of time is really the emergence of the modern world. It's fascinating because the assumptions that we make about the world are often influenced by this period of time, and most people have never even heard the details of it. But we're still we have these instincts, these knee-jerk reactions about certain issues and events that come up. And what we're doing is we're as in the United States, at least, and in England, we're all kind of having this collective distant memory of what happened to Charles I in the 17th century and to England in the 17th century. This is the period of the English Civil War. And everything that ended up impacting the philosophy, the motivations of the founding fathers of the United States, all of that was brewing because of what happened in the English Civil War. So, as a result, the more you learn about the English Civil War, in a sense, the more even the United States makes sense. A lot of the cultural issues we've been wrestling with and struggling with on a political level makes sense. So that's more the political dimension of what we're talking about.
Sure.
But then there's also the religious dimension. And again, it helps make a lot of sense of the Protestant religious world that even exists in the United States, which I think is so exciting and fascinating. And then there's just another level. As an Anglican deacon, there's like the Anglican side of things. And we could talk a little bit about that too. I think this is one area where, I think every denomination has like the nice and polite version that they present to, the other types of churches. And then this is where Anglicanism gets a little weird in some sense. It's kind of where it gets quirky.
Oh, okay. All right.
Because this is one area where you have this king, Charles I, who is a king of England in a recent century. 17th century is relatively recent compared to, say, the Council of Nicaea. And he is considered a saint in the Anglican Church, despite the fact that he is a very polarizing, some would say, tyrant. So what do you do with that? Now, for me, I am a American Anglican. So my favorite Anglicans are people like George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry. A lot of our founding fathers were Anglican. So it doesn't mean that just because you're Anglican, you're immediately going to side with some British monarch. Surely Patrick Henry wasn't doing that, and nor do most American Anglicans today. However, if we can kind of roll back the clock a little bit, I think Charles I, he comes to the throne in the 1620s. He's the son of James I, and James is the one who commissioned the King James Bible. That's why most people remember him. What was that?
Of much acclaim.
Of much acclaim.
Yeah.
Now, James had this strong belief in the divine right of kings. His belief was, God has put me on the throne. He has ordained that I would be on the throne, and therefore, as my subject, it's your job to get in line. That was basically the idea. His son, Charles I, also had this conviction, and maybe even stronger than James I. Charles was no diplomat towards his subjects. And a lot of people criticize him for that because he was just not the most smooth ruler in many ways. He had very clear convictions about what was right and what was wrong. And he ruled England with an iron fist. I mean, during the reigns of James I and Charles I, this is where you see a lot of Puritans leaving England and going to New England. Now, what did James I and Charles I believe? They believed in what we now call the Anglican Church, but essentially, just to kind of make sense of what the Anglican Church is, there were many expressions of reformers during the Protestant Reformation. And that's something that's often overlooked nowadays, just how diverse reformers were.
For sure.
And we kind of overlook that because we look at the Reformation in the United States through an American lens. And so when we think reformer, we think, oh, Presbyterian, Reformed Baptist,
Lutheran.
Maybe Lutheran, although a lot of like Reformed folks or even say Methodist folks learn about what Lutherans do, that they sometimes pray with the rosary, that they celebrate a mass. Like that makes them uncomfortable. But that is a Lutheran expression of Protestantism that looks very, quote unquote Roman Catholic to say a Presbyterian or a Reformed Baptist or any sort of Baptist really, or any sort of lower church, you might say, Protestant. So
it's interesting when you mentioned earlier that, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
But it's interesting when you said earlier how this period, specifically the English Civil War, is going to really have this huge cultural impact on how Westerners tends to view authorities and religious institution, monarchy, etc. And it's funny because the perfect example of that is the average Christian's understanding of what the Reformation was. Because a lot of people kind of look at the non-denom Christian evangelical sphere and they kind of assume, oh, this is what the Reformation was for. The Reformation was to detach ourselves from the body of Catholicism. It's that the Reformation was a move against the institution. And I think almost all of the reformers would probably say that is not what we were trying to do. But for us, like the very Americanized interpretation of the Reformation is it's the punk rock gospel. We're just doing our own thing. And it's like, no, that's really not at all what the goal was. So I don't know. No. That's interesting. I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. And in fact, in the Anglican tradition, the 16th century reformers. So this is the century before Charles I. Just giving some backstory to who Charles was by talking about what happened before him. But the reformers before Charles I, they very clearly articulated that we are not trying to get away from being Catholic.
Right.
But instead, we're trying to kind of remove the barnacles that have accumulated on the Catholic tradition over the centuries. And their idea was, we want to get back to the Catholic tradition of the first centuries of the church. And a huge part of maintaining that Catholicity in the eyes of the Anglican reformers was, we want to make sure that with all the reforms that we're doing, we don't lose that connection to the early church that we have through apostolic succession. And apostolic succession is this view that the church has held since the 2nd century at least, possibly even the end of the 1st century, that the Catholic Church, that basically the true church is within those churches that have bishops who have been ordained by bishops who, if you trace it all the way back, they were men who had hands laid on them by the apostles themselves. And so then being part of the one holy Catholic and apostolic faith meant, one, you are living in fidelity to the apostolic writings, the New Testament. And 2, that you are within that line of apostolic succession of bishops, Now, that was the original idea of the Anglican reformers and some other reform groups in Europe as well. But it's very important in England in the 16th century to maintain that. But there were a lot of bumps along the road in England. I mean, the English people got whiplash in the 16th century because not only was Henry VIII quite a wild character.
Yeah.
And his church wasn't even really Protestant. He broke away from Rome, but if you were to attend a service, it would be like Roman Catholicism without the Pope. He still believed in purgatory. He still had a Latin Mass. It was really his son who was a really extreme Calvinist, very convinced. Then he died at age 15. So very young Calvinist king dies young.
He died in cage stage, man. No wonder he was so extreme. Yeah, a 15-year-old 15-year-old Calvinist? That sounds like a nightmare, bro.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Twitter's full of them.
He was a cage stage 15-year-old Calvinist, and his body just couldn't take it. And he died.
Oh, man. God just snatched him up.
So then he dies, and the next ruler is his sister, Mary, his half-sister. Now, Mary's Roman Catholic. So they've gone from cage stage Calvinists. England has gone from cage stage Calvinists, as you said, to back to Roman Catholicism. And Mary ended up burning 300 Protestants. This is what Fox's Book of Martyrs is about. Like the stories. This is Bloody Mary. This is Bloody Mary.
Shoot.
A lot of Protestants in England, Anglicans, they fled to Geneva and they hunkered down with John Calvin. And they kind of sat at his feet, learned from him. And one of these folks is John Knox.
I have one context question that I want to ask before you jump into John Knox. Was Mary the one who got Thomas Cranmer burned at the stake? Is that?
She was.
Okay. Okay. And how?
Yeah. And Latimer and Ridley.
And how does Cranmer fit into the picture with it? I mean, obviously, massive influence with early Anglicanism brings us the Book of Common Prayer. But like, was he a stabilizing figure in the midst of those waves in England?
Yeah, very much so, I would say. He had to keep a cool head in the midst of some volatile times. And there's a really great show. I think it's called Cromwell. No, it's not called that. It's about Oliver Cromwell. I'll just see if I can remember it. What is it called?
While you're thinking of it,
I'll figure it out.
There's a quote I just heard the other day, just emphasizing for one, the amount of crossover that was going on at this time between, you're talking about the diversity of what was going on at the time of the Reformation, but a lot of these guys were actually dialoguing with each other, and they were, there was a lot of reason to do it too. Like, for example, the Calvinists and the Lutherans really needed to get on the same page so that they could have a unified front against the Holy Roman Emperor. But oftentimes Calvin, especially, I think is seen as like kind of sectarian. But I heard a quote, I didn't know this apparently, and I don't have the source for this, I'm sure it could be found. Apparently, Calvin had written a letter to Cranmer at one point. I guess Calvin didn't like to leave home a whole lot, but he said something along the lines of like, I would cross 10,000 seas for the sake of unity, or something like that. Just wanting to be finding as much what they wanted, what I think all of these guys wanted, maybe not Luther quite so much, but like they wanted like a Catholic council, basically. Like they wanted there to be dialogue and a certain degree of uniformity across the continent that unfortunately wasn't achieved.
The vision was a cross-European Reformed Catholic Church that would stand for not having identity in, we're not Roman Catholic. Like that's not what they wanted. you can never have a solid identity in what you're not. Their identity,
especially when it goes against the Apostles' Creed.
Right. Yeah. Their identity is, we want to be that Catholic Church that has the barnacles stripped away of the centuries of the medieval years, a Catholic Church that more reflects the early church. So anyway, try to give a brief overview here, but I think it's fascinating. So stop me if I'm going into too much detail.
No, you're doing great. But, I'm just... Yeah,
so you got these exiles from England, and they're all hiding out from Bloody Mary, who's killed hundreds of Protestants, burned them at the stake. And these exiles hunker down in different places of Europe, but one place is Geneva with John Calvin. And so they're studying under John Calvin, and John Knox is he's from the British Isles. He's come to Geneva. He's also there, and he starts developing, hopefully he thinks, a political / theological argument for why the English people should rise up against Bloody Mary and overthrow her. And this is wild, because people are very convinced that the sovereign is there because God put him or her there. People fought wars.
Was this Knox's, because Knox took I think it was Knox. He had taken the Lutherans because we did an episode one time on the doctrine of the lesser magistrate and the Magberg Confession. Was that what he was working with and building like a case for? That
probably was, at this period of time, was influential to that. Okay. But this paper he writes, he publishes it, and I love the title because it's just so wild. The title of his paper is "The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women."
Oh my gosh. That's crazy. I love that.
His argument...
That's the name of my first mixtape. That's paper. Crazy. I didn't know that.
That's so good.
The argument that he makes in this document, among other things, is that, women shouldn't be ruling a country. And... so that's one reason she's not a legitimate ruler. Wow. Now, unfortunately for John Knox, soon after he publishes this paper, Mary dies. That's fortunate and unfortunate. And she's replaced by Queen Elizabeth, a Protestant queen, who, while she's Protestant, she's heard about this paper by John Knox. She's not happy about it.
Oh my god!
And so John Knox returns to England and does not win the favor of Queen Elizabeth at all. And this is not the only reason, but Presbyterianism was not something Queen Elizabeth was willing to entertain. And partially because of this document, because she's not happy about it. She's a very convinced Reformed Catholic, you might say. Anglicanism, you really, it's sort of the duck-billed platypus of denominations, because it's not... People want to compare it to different things, like, it's like a beaver, it's like a duck, but it's not. It's its own thing, and it's Reformed Catholicism. And as a result, Elizabeth has both Catholic convictions and Reformed convictions at the same time.
Which means she's probably got Catholics that don't love her and plenty of Reformed people that also don't love her too, right?
That is right, because so many English people came back to England who had been studying at the feet of John Calvin, and they were far more Reformed at this point than they were Catholic. And those English people became known as the Puritans, and the ancestors of the Puritans. And their conviction became more and more, if it looks Roman Catholic, take it out. Whereas Queen Elizabeth and the Church of England, the Anglican Church, their conviction was more, no, if it's not broken, don't fix it, right, in a sense, when it comes to Roman Catholicism. So I'm setting the stage here because by the time Queen Elizabeth dies, and then she's succeeded by James, and then James is succeeded by Charles, you've had decades upon decades building where you have these really three factions growing. One is the Roman Catholics in England. They are suppressed by the Protestant church. And the Pope actually declared Queen Elizabeth a heretic and invited any Roman Catholic kingdom that wanted to free reign to come in and take over England. And
that's insane.
Yeah. This is why, it's hard to parse out.
I'm like eating popcorn right now. This is fascinating. Oh my gosh, dude.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, Queen Elizabeth finds out that the largest armada on Earth, the Spanish Armada, is barreling down on England, threatening to invade. So the Roman Catholics are, in a very real sense, with military power, seeking to invade this kingdom that's ruled by a Protestant queen. She dons armor. She gets on a horse. She rides out and she says, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like, you may say I have just the body of a woman, but I have the heart of a king and a king of England too. And it's a very epic scene in church history. And essentially, through a combination of technology and a weather pattern that set in, the Spanish Armada was sunk and routed by the much smaller ships in the English Navy. Spanish had these huge ships that couldn't move fast. England had Sir Francis Drake and these little schooners that would zip around. And they just absolutely kicked Spain's butt. They sent them running. So anyway, all that to say, the English people, after this happened, had a great amount of patriotism. It really solidified Protestantism. And whether you're Anglican or whether you're a Puritan, you may have your disagreements with each other, but you're both terrified of Roman Catholics because they've proven that they are willing to do whatever's possible.
That kind of explains why they were able to coexist for a little bit. I've had questions about that.
Common enemy. Yeah.
Common enemy. Yeah.
Well, because you think historically they had Bloody Mary, who even today is seen as a pretty ruthless anti-Protestant tyrant. They had the 30 Years' War that happened in continental Europe. And then they just had this whole thing where the Pope basically put a hit out on their whole country. I mean, they've got Catholic trauma out the wazoo, basically. So I can see how that can just kind of settle into almost a paranoia a little bit.
Yes. And I want to be really clear. I mean, it probably goes without saying. I in no way harbor the ill feelings of 16th and 17th century politics. I mean, there are actually really, I think, inspiring and courageous Roman Catholic saints who are just trying to survive in England during this time period. Yeah. And I can really see the light of Christ shining in their lives too. So history is complicated.
Oh, yeah.
History is even more complicated.
Dude, I remember the existential crisis I had when I realized that some of my favorite Spanish and Italian authors were relevant during the Counter-Reformation, which was literally just Europe being like, no, come back, Catholicism's better, forget those Protestants. And then I was like, oh wow, these weren't just Catholics, they were intentionally anti-Protestant Catholics. Yes. But they also wrote some of the best stuff ever written, Catholic or Protestant. So yeah, it is such a complex tapestry, which I think is so beautiful. And yeah, to just draw a line and say, this is my side of church history, that's the enemy side, that's such a silly way. And I think unproductive and doesn't really give a lot of glory to the complexity that God's kind of working out through this. So 100% agree with that.
Yeah. And when politics are wrapped up into it, and this is the problem with having church and state fused, is everything religious has political connotations, everything political has religious connotations, and you can't really divide them.
Absolutely.
Now, Elizabeth dies, succeeded by James. During James's reign, you have the attempt by Guy Fawkes to blow up the Parliament building, and Guy Fawkes was a a Roman Catholic terrorist, essentially. He planted a bunch of explosives under the British Parliament building, or the English Parliament building. Wasn't Britain just yet. And they discovered it just in time. And that just more reinforced this like Roman Catholic boogeyman almost. People in England, whether you're Anglican, whether you're Puritan, you are both terrified of Roman Catholicism. And so now we get to Charles. Mm-hmm. And Charles is a very convicted Reformed Catholic. And one of the most important things to him is he wants to preserve this ancient apostolic line of bishops in the Church of England. He sees the British Church, or the English Church, as one of three branches of the Catholic tradition. So there's the Roman Catholics, there's what he called the Greek Catholics, we might call them Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah. And
then he sees Anglicanism as this third ancient, now Reformed Catholic expression. And the Puritans would have, they did have so many things to say about that.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, he believed it was his role, his job as the king, to make sure that all of his subjects were believing correctly about religion.
See, that's such an interesting thing because, just like you said, because there is no line between church and state, the king essentially is responsible for kind of catechizing the people. And that would be complex under any circumstance, but especially when you're dealing with all of this kind of cultural ripples of all of their negative experiences with Catholicism. You basically have a king whose job it is to correct not just the doctrine, but the mindsets of all of these people. Yeah. And that sounds like a terribly daunting task for someone to have to take on and rule a country, basically.
Yeah, and up until this point, people just kind of accepted it. I mean, before the Reformation, kings were seen as being subject to the Pope, in Western Europe at least. Mm-hmm. But now that we have the Reformation, oddly enough, now the kings aren't subject even to the Pope. They have divine right to be in charge. And one of Charles's titles was the Supreme Governor of the Church of England. So, not the head. That's a historical mistake a lot of people make. Henry VIII called himself the head. By the time that Elizabeth came into her rule, she changed the title to the Supreme Governor because she was uncomfortable with that title. And so every successive monarch has had the title Supreme Governor. But the people saw, and the king saw himself as almost a different ontological human being than the subjects. King Charles said, "A subject and a sovereign are clean, different things."
Oh my gosh. Okay. Yeah. I could see that rubbing some people the wrong way.
Well, it would today.
Yeah. Oh, but very true.
During his time and before, kind of status quo.
So for the Puritans who were going to eventually kind of take arms against this dude, did they see him as being wrong because he was a tyrant, or wrong because he was just a tyrant with the wrong affiliation?
The latter, for sure.
Okay.
And I can kind of demonstrate that in a number of ways. First of all, he was too... you might call high church. A lot of the way he liked to... I mean, Anglicanism's always had more evangelical expressions and then more Anglo-Catholic expressions. And Charles, he definitely wanted the more high church feel. You know, he wanted to have vestments and robes, candles. He wanted things that the Puritans were just really uncomfortable with. Also, he did kind of the unthinkable, and this freaked a lot of people out. He married a Roman Catholic.
That'll do it.
And the real fear was, oh man, this is the beginning of Roman Catholics taking over.
I mean, and fair, that's a fair concern to have, I would say, if your king marries a Catholic wife.
Well, and one of the things that I read, Ben, is that one of the concerns was not just that he was too soft on Catholics, but that he was a puppet of the Catholics in Europe, essentially, right?
Yes, that was a fear, and I can understand why. Mm-hmm. I think reading his personal letters, it's pretty clear he was a very convicted Reformed Catholic. You might say Protestant to a degree.
Right.
But he saw one of his primary duties was to defend the doctrines expressed in the Book of Common Prayer and its Reformed document, the 39 Articles. It's Reformation era document, the 39 Articles. So when you read the 39 Articles, which is, it's sort of Anglicanism's confession, you might say. It's what we call a formulary, which is like an expression of some convictions that the Anglican Church had during the time of the Reformation, that are still binding for Anglicans today, in a sense, defining, like, this is what our doctrine looks like. It expresses some very Reformation type things.
Sure.
This is just a side note that might be interesting to you, Ben. The Reformed denomination that I'm in actually allows churches to hold the 39 Articles as their confession if they so choose, which is really fascinating.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. Nice. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the 39 Articles as an Anglican deacon, and Charles was too. But he also was he had a lot of hubris. And when he was told by advisors, you should not marry a Roman Catholic, this is not going to be good for peace at home, his attitude towards that was kind of, I'm a king, I can do whatever I want.
So there wasn't even this sense of like, I'm doing this as a king for like political reasons. I'm doing this to show that, hey, look, we can marry Catholics. Like, or was it legitimately just, I'm going to do what I want and you can't tell me what to do?
It was more that. I think there was some desire to solidify England's place in Europe after a tumultuous century. Mm-hmm. By creating alliances and hopefully getting England back in a more friendly place with places like France.
Sure.
But at the same time, while Charles is ramping up this divine right of kings and a lot of actions that are just making people uncomfortable, you've got a growing Puritan population that's getting more and more uncomfortable. And Charles is seeking to impose high church Anglicanism. And meanwhile, the Puritans have gained control of Parliament. And so through parliamentary acts, they're more and more trying to crack down on some of the more high church aspects of England. Mm-hmm. And then Charles does this thing that I think it's one of the funniest and most tragic parts of English history. He tries to impose the Book of Common Prayer on the Scottish Presbyterians. Now, John Knox has gone to Scotland. Mm-hmm. Scotland is very convicted in its Presbyterianism. Bunch of crotchety, convicted Presbyterians. And Charles says, no, you know what? I'm done with that. Scotland is going to be Anglican now. And so he sends...
Clarifying question. Would the Puritans' biggest issues with the Book of Common Prayer be the use of apocryphal texts, or is it just that was it connected to just their allergy towards anything that looked Roman Catholic? Or is...
both of those things.
Okay.
So the Puritans had issues with a lot of things. Yes, the Book of Common Prayer has readings from the Apocrypha in it, although it does not consider the Apocrypha to
Holy
be inspired scripture. But it's read for learning and education about what was going on in the intertestamental periods. But also there were customs that are mentioned in the Book of Common Prayer. One of them is when a baptism occurs, the sign of the cross is made on the forehead of the person being baptized, and the Puritans were very against that. The Puritans were also against wearing wedding rings. And so the Book of Common Prayer requires a wedding ring at the service. And that to them they saw as just, smelling of popery to have a wedding ring.
Is it just that these things are it's the ceremonial aspect to it? Like they wanted it to be a little bit more divorced from that? Is that kind of the concern?
Yeah.
The
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I think anything that just hearkened in any way of a memory of Roman Catholicism, they wanted to throw
the
it
Puritans
out.
were really tight on defending there being only two sacraments, and we would affirm. I'm not when I say we, I'm just thinking in my own context, but like there's lots of things that are sacramental in nature that aren't one of the two sacraments that Christ instituted. But it seems like the Puritans were especially wary of things that were sacramental in nature that made their way into the liturgies for fear of it looking too much like bona fide sacrament of the church. Like a marriage is sacramental in nature, right? Preaching is, you could argue, is sacramental in nature, but we don't call it a sacrament in the same sense that we think of baptism or the Lord's Supper. So I would suspect that would be a big part of their rejection of some of these things, is wanting to avoid the appearance of something being a sacrament that's not.
Yeah. And also, the Book of Common Prayer, in addition to what you said, it's very hinged on the church calendar. And that was another thing the Puritans wanted to throw out altogether. There's a service for Ash Wednesday. The Puritans were anti-Christmas. So all these different things made Puritans uncomfortable. And here's Charles. He says, no, I've got my Book of Common Prayer here, so I'll wave it around. He said, you must use this book. And I love the Book of Common Prayer. I can't think of a worse way to make people want to use the Book of Common Prayer than to demand by force of law that they pick it up and worship with it.
Yeah.
And so the ministers in Scotland are commanded, by law, you must do your next service with the Book of Common Prayer. And there's this moment where there's this service in Scotland, and the minister stands up with the Book of Common Prayer, begins the service, and the whole church is full of Presbyterians who are just so angry. And finally, this woman in the middle of the service, she can't take it anymore. She picks up the stool that she's sitting on and she hurls it at the minister. And the whole church breaks up into a riot.
Oh my God.
And this riot just breaks out, starts descending across Scotland. Charles sends troops up to Scotland to get things under control. But people are enraged. And this rebellion, it starts to spread in England. It starts to spread in Ireland.
The chair heard around the world.
Yeah, it was the stool
toss.
heard around the world.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
So this is all in the middle of the 17th century now. We're now well over a century past the time of Martin Luther.
Sure.
And now you've got really Protestants fighting Protestants.
Mm-hmm.
Over, really, the question is how far from Catholic practice do we want to be?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so Parliament, which is ruled by the Puritans, they raise up an army against the king. King Charles raises an army against Parliament. And you see the government of England is now going at it against each other. And it goes on and on.
Is Parliament, I don't know much about British government, especially during this time. Is Parliament, is there a democratic element to how Parliament works? Like, so could you say Parliament was more representative of the people of England at this time?
To a degree. I mean, it definitely was not democratic, but it more represented the subjects of England.
Gotcha.
Having a say in the voice of government. And actually, at one point, a little bit before what I was talking about, Charles had really made Parliament mad. They were passing laws he didn't like, and so he just said, "I'm the king. I am dissolving Parliament."
Oh my gosh. Yeah, so I can see the tyrant argument a little bit, because it definitely, I mean, he had the power to be a king, so it's not like he was, doing more. He was working outside of his job description, but I can also see a little bit of a lack of tact and discretion that I think probably bit him in the tail near the end of this.
I think he had a lot of lack of tact, and unfortunately for him, he lived in an age that required immense tact if you were going to survive.
Sure.
Charles would just say, he'd drop one-liners like this one: "Princes are not bound to give an account of their actions to anyone but God alone."
This guy's crazy. I almost admire just the cojones a little bit. I'll ask a quick question before we get into the Civil War itself. When I remember looking into kind of the early start of like the pre-Reformation under like Wycliffe and the Lollards and kind of like the rebellions happening around that time, I remember that part of the conflict was the socioeconomic element, where what would become the Protestants, these were disgruntled Catholics who were frustrated that they felt like the wealthy nobles no longer reflected their interests. Was there any of that kind of like, was there kind of this sense that the king is this Anglican dude shoving his weight around, but we, the common people, we're just these like, we're just these salt of the earth Presbyterians? Like, was that kind of an element to this?
I think there was, and different people have made a bigger deal of that than others.
Sure.
One person who made a big deal about it actually was Karl Marx. And he said that the Puritans were like proto-Marxists because they were
hilarious,
rising up against the aristocracy.
I haven't heard too many Reformed Baptists roll out that one-liner before.
I was gonna say I don't know a lot of modern day Puritan stands who would put that on their Twitter bio, but I think that's awesome.
I'm gonna start calling them that. That's good. I like that.
Proto-Marxist. That's crazy.
So yeah, you've got Parliament, and it's raised an army against the king. And actually, Parliament has more of the purse strings of the kingdom, so they have a much better army. They're more well funded. But this civil war, it rages on. It dies down for a bit, then it pops back up. They're really kind of two civil wars. It goes on for over 10 years. Finally, Charles is captured, and the Puritans, they are not happy. They are the Parliament, the parliamentary army is led by a man named Oliver Cromwell. And Cromwell basically, like, people were saying, okay, what do we do with the king? Do we keep him imprisoned? It was not really part of the perception of possibilities that they could execute a king. And part of this is because they knew scripture. And you see the example that David sets with Saul. Like, I will not touch the Lord's anointed. That was very much part of their worldview. Now we're now the inheritors of so many centuries of revolution that it doesn't scandalize us to think of chopping off a king's head. It's almost kind of funny to some people.
It's victorious.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're sticking it to the man, that kind of thing. But even though these are Puritans, there's still this inherited, almost, ancient sense that if you touch the Lord's anointed, you are jeopardizing your own soul and certainly your kingdom, because God is not happy. But Oliver Cromwell, he's a very convicted Puritan, and he said, I will have his head with the crown on it. Like, he was not wanting to compromise. And so there's some really beautiful letters that Charles wrote to his children. as he's realizing that I am going to be executed. And he was condemned as a traitor. He wrote some really beautiful letters to his children, and he basically was telling them, I am going to die, and I want you to stay faithful to the Reformed Catholic faith of the 39 Articles and the Book of Common Prayer. And he would always emphasize, and the historic episcopate, because he was offered freedom if he would just accept Presbyterian church government.
Wow.
And in his mind, he said, no, like this is our tie of our English church to the ancient Catholic faith of the historic apostolic succession. And so this is a huge reason why later the Anglican Church held him up as a saint, because he died preserving the apostolic succession of the Anglican Church. So anyway, he writes these letters to his kids, and actually I saved part of one of them. I don't see if I... let's see. Oh, can't find it now. But they're really beautiful letters, I think. Just expressing his love for his kids and his hope that they would continue to defend this faith that at the time looked like it was kind of done. The Puritans, I don't know. I always had heard of the Puritans as escaping to New England and kind of seeing them as the underdogs. But at this point in English history, the king is the underdog. Like, he's been beaten. And the Church of England is an underdog. There were Anglicans fleeing to the New World. They settled more in the southern colonies, whereas the Puritans had settled in the northern colonies. But they were all fleeing when it looked like English politics was not going their way. So I think that's a fascinating insight into American history, because you have your Presbyterian Puritans settling in New England with all their distinctives. And then you have the high church Anglicans settling more in the southern colonies, South Carolina, Virginia. And they each have these assumptions about reality that are very different.
Yeah. And they share this chip on their shoulder too, right?
Yes.
Like they're both there because they were fearful of their existence in their homeland. So even though they're on opposite ends of this, not totally, complete spectrum, like they're not totally opposite from one another, but they are very different, but they're united in their feeling of, I had to flee to preserve what is valuable to me.
Yeah. What I believe, what my faith, what I believe is the true faith in a sense.
Yeah.
So anyway, Charles was led out to his execution. He was beheaded. And the moment that, if you can imagine, there's this angry crowd of Puritans. They're all surrounding this platform, demanding the death of the king. There's soldiers there. Charles is led out. And when the axe falls and his head is severed from his body, there are few moments in history quite as momentous as this. It's like all of history took a deep breath because something had happened that could never be taken back. And that is that the British people, and really humanity as a whole, was beginning to grasp a different conception of what it meant to be a citizen, what it meant to be a subject, what it meant to have a sense of autonomy and conviction that may be different than your state or your church. And there's this book. I love this book. It's by J.R.H. Mormon. And I wanted to read this paragraph because I think he captures this moment that the axe falls.
Yeah, please.
So on January 30th, 1649, the king was beheaded on a scaffold outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. When the bleeding head was held up, a cry of horror from the crowd drowned the derisive shouts of the soldiers. During the trial at the hour of death, Charles had behaved with quiet courage and dignity, which had won many to his side, even among those who had been ready to take up arms against him 7 years before. Royal despotism had been a bad thing, but military despotism was worse.
Mm.
The English people disliked the sight of blood, and the execution of a king sent a thrill of horror and detestation through the country, which has never been forgotten. It has been described as a crime against England even more than a crime against Charles. But not only did it outrage the deepest feelings of the country, it also alienated many who might have been Cromwell's supporters. And again, Cromwell's the one who was the head of the military, of the Puritan military. The regicides, these are the people who have killed the king, they little realized that in cutting off Charles's head, they were cutting their own throats.
Dang, that's so good.
Part of that is Charles really behaved with a lot of dignity before his death. He didn't show fear. He wasn't panicking. He just very calmly went to his death. And his final words were, "I go from a corruptible crown to an incorruptible crown."
Oof.
So he kind of made this presentation. Yeah. He's good at one-liners, whether they were poorly chosen or very well chosen.
Oh my gosh, that's so good.
Anyway, long story short, for the next 10 plus years, England was ruled by the Puritans without a king. There was no king. It became a republic. And so through the 1650s, you have the Commonwealth of England being ruled really as in many ways, a military dictatorship headed by Oliver Cromwell. And this is the time period where they did things like banned Christmas. They banned a lot of the activities people like to do on Sundays, like bowling and dancing. You couldn't wear a wedding ring. There were all these different things that made the Puritans really... The English people got tired of the Puritans after 10 years.
Wow.
And after 10 years, they invited Charles's son, Charles II, to return. And so he was installed as the next king.
Wow.
And then that's a whole other story.
Wow. Man, it's fascinating. There's so many things. I have so many thoughts that I want to share, but the one that popped to mind first, especially as you were describing his execution, I'm reading through this really interesting novel that kind of works through this historical journal of a German 17th century executioner, and just like the role that he played in society and kind of fighting to reclaim honor for his family name and all that stuff. But what's interesting is that beheading is often seen as the most honorable way to execute someone. To be hanged or something severe like being drawn and quartered or something like that would be seen as like a very vile thing. So it's fascinating that for them to behead the king was like, well, I mean, yeah, we're executing him, but we're at least showing him some dignity in doing so. But then at the act of it happening, it's just like, oh, we've done something really bad. Like this was actually a very, very gruesome thing that we've just done. And it's interesting because you were saying like to commit regicide, to kill a king is one of those things that you can never undo. And are we potentially condemning ourselves and even condemning our very movement and what we stand for in doing something so aggressive? And it seems like that kind of was the prophecy that fulfilled itself. Like they went too far, and then Puritanism did not have certainly it still had a legacy, but not the legacy of the Anglican Church and not the legacy of political influence that they were looking to aspire to.
Yeah, and just to be careful that I nuance this out, you can hear a story like this with armies and battles and civil war and kind of overly simplify the two sides. And there's a lot of nuance. For example, many of the Church of England ministers have a lot of sympathies with the Puritans. And there was one bishop, Usher was his name, who was a Puritan, but he's also a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Puritans wanted to get rid of bishops, and yet here he is, a Puritan bishop. And even though a lot of his sympathies were with the Puritans, he expressed very eloquently just the horror that he felt in seeing that it had gone amiss and had gone towards killing the king.
There's so many winds of
some of my favorite 17th century authors are Puritans. So
there's so much winds of revolution that are stirring through Europe at this time. To me, it seems like a relatively tragic tale of. I mean, you kind of have the standard. It seems like whoever is in power is persecuting the other. If Charles is in power, it's not a great time to be a Puritan. If the Puritans are in power, it's not a great time to be an Anglican. But those struggles pale in comparison with killing a king, which is a relatively revolutionary thing to do. And it seems like revolution is like it's like bringing a gun to a fist fight kind of thing, right? It's like you can have your struggles, but there's always that tool that's tempting you on the side of like, well, we could do this and that could solve our problems. But when we look at the story of Europe, the more revolution you have, the worse it gets in any particular country. We had this is a whole nother side topic that we could get into. John and I both had a church history professor who made an interesting observation once that wherever the conversion of the people groups in Europe had been like the most severe or forced at the time as Christendom was growing, that tends to be the places where revolution was the fiercest. And so England and England's kind of like in the middle, it seems. Like Ireland, like no revolution because it was like a very organic like faith growing there. Germany being a little bit the more Germanic areas were a little bit more intense. But yeah, the story. My hope is that as we look back on church history in Europe, that we can grow a healthy fear of revolution, right? It's good to fight about your convictions. It's good to hold true to what is what you believe to be truth as revealed in Scripture, but there are tools that you can use that make it all for naught.
I think that's very well said, and really that execution of the king, you can see tendrils of revolution in later centuries that go right back to that moment, whether it's the French Revolution or revolutions in the 19th century. A lot of the logic for revolution began in the decades after Charles was executed because people were trying to process, what does this mean for the world now? You got writers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke a few decades later, people writing ideas about what does it mean to be an individual, a citizen? What is our responsibility towards government and kings? And some of those ideas I think were really good, but in a lot of cases, people began to take those ideas and use them almost as an excuse or as an incentive to have just one revolution after the next without any end in sight, really. And so now I think we hear the word revolution, and it's almost a positive outcome in the way a lot of people see the world.
I watched a movie. I'm about to spoil the ending, so hopefully by not saying what the movie is, that won't harm anybody. But I watched a movie where the end of the film was essentially a scene of mob violence where the leader of that country is just like killed. And although it's not it's not like a propaganda film. It's not like, hooray, we did it. It's very clear that like this was the direction that the culture was moving towards, and they felt like to really resolve the issues that we were feeling, this is what we needed to do. Like, it's not enough to, and honestly, it feels the same as what happened with King Charles I, is that they had already won, they had already captured the king. They could have easily thrown him in a cell and just had him be held captive by the Puritans forever. But this idea of we have to make a statement, like, I almost feel in this age of political just dissension, like there is something almost refreshing about hearing like we have to be able to hold some integrity in how we perceive the leaders above us, because we don't have to say that they're God's anointed. We don't have to say that every president, every prime minister is God's anointed doing all of God's beautiful work. Sometimes we have leaders that kind of stink, and we should be able to call a spade a spade. However, there should be like, I feel like there's a lot of Christian circles that I could step into, even in my own personal life, where if I said something, and this is regardless of who's leading, if I said, well, guys, let's remember what the epistles say about praying for our leaders and keeping our political authorities in prayer, there'd be like a wave of discomfort, like, but we pray for the people that we like, John. Like, what are you talking about? So it is just like knowing how deep-seated our paranoia, I wouldn't even call it paranoia, our distrust in the authorities is, and our kind of like casual resentment of them, like this assumption that they are without integrity, that they are not working in our best interests. I don't know. It's just, I can see a lot of, like you said, if this is the seed, then we're currently living in the shadow of that tree. You know, we're sitting in the shade under the oak that was planted here. And it's a lot to process.
Hey, guys, and, real quick, my device is about to die, so I'm going to sign off just a couple minutes early and let you guys wrap it.
All right, Thomas.
Ben,
good to see
good to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, take care. Right.
Good to see you, Tommy. Later, man.
I was just gonna say, I think culturally we are the inheritors of so much of the ideals of the age of revolution with the French Revolution, and I wouldn't actually include the American Revolution as part of what we're talking about for a number of reasons that are very complicated, or more. It would require more time than we have this evening.
Very fair, sure.
But the American Revolution was entirely different philosophically than the age of revolution with the French Revolution and then later the European revolutions in the 19th century. But I think a lot of Americans have just sort of, through osmosis, they've accepted a lot of logic from this revolutionary time period that continues to be part of our world today. And more people need to reconcile how does that compare to the epistles, as you say, the teachings of the apostles, the teachings of the Old Testament. How do you reconcile those two things?
Yeah.
And I think Charles is, I actually, Charles I is special to me because he was at first really off-putting to me when I first encountered him. And with Our Church Speaks, I am drawing all of the different saints that are listed in the calendar of saints in the Book of Common Prayer. So I got to January 30th, which is the day Charles was executed. And there on the calendar of saints is Charles I. And I thought, am I going to actually draw a saint picture of this guy? Because at first I didn't see why he was a saint. It took me some digging to uncover that. And in many cases, I still feel a little conflicted about it.
Sure.
But one thing I've realized, and one thing that I kind of came to terms with, was whether you admire Charles and the sacrifices that he made, that he even went to his death to defend those ideals, or whether you just think he's a tyrant, I think that, he serves as a reminder that Jesus Christ is the savior of all, including polarizing political opponents.
Mm-hmm.
And that whether you have a polarizing political opponent or not, like, every person stands before Christ needing that grace, that we all stand before Christ ultimately in his judgment seat.
Sure.
That we're not the ones ultimately holding the axe over anybody's head.
Sure. And I think, to me, it's a good reminder that, we don't have the luxury of knowing as much about a lot of historical figures in Christianity as we do know about Charles, because, just as you said, the 17th century is still relatively recent compared to, like you said, like the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century. And so, like you said, was he a guy who really needed tact that he didn't show during a time that was very sensitive? Oh, so there's no doubt about that. But was he also able to show a great, staggering amount of Christian virtue under times of great duress? And did he stand on principles that many of the saints that we look to have stood on? Like, did he suffer from being probably pretty pig-headed sometimes and a little oppressive? Like, oh, certainly. But I don't think those things disqualify him, just as I'm sure, there's probably church fathers who, were frustrating to argue with, or maybe, interrupted a lot in conversation, like things like that. So I am curious. I wanted to ask you this, and then we can kind of wrap up. And I guess I can ask you as an Anglican, and then I'll ask you just as Ben. So like, sure, you can speak from the Anglican view, and then, like, do you see Charles as a martyr?
Yeah. So from an Anglican view, our Book of Common Prayer has, I think it actually says Charles the Martyr.
Okay.
On January 30th. So, there's some people pay more attention to that than others in the Anglican Church. It used to be an official day of remembrance in England that I think they kept it until 1859. So they would remember that day.
Substantial.
And it was like they would have church services on January 30th, remembering Charles as a martyr. For me personally, that's a really good question. I think, in a sense, he was a martyr because he died partially because he would not compromise in what he believed to be the true expression of the church and defending it, that it was in jeopardy. And he was dying to preserve that for future generations. So ultimately, he was giving his life for Christ. He was being a witness of Christ and his church in that sense. But man, the 17th century was so complicated, so complex. And so if he's a martyr in my mind, he's just also someone who I just think, man, with a little bit of compassion, with a little bit of added tact, maybe you could have avoided this, I wonder.
Sure.
But, that's one thing about Anglican Protestant saints. We don't necessarily always remember those saints that lived spotless lives that are not open to critique. Because of the grace of Christ, that's why we're saved. And that's why anything in our life is worthwhile or worth remembering. And so Charles definitely led a life that needed the grace of Jesus Christ. And so do I.
Yeah.
And but he definitely was someone that I would say was, in his capacity and his time, in his understandings of what his role was in the world, he was trying to serve Christ in the way that he knew.
Yeah.
So, yeah, church history is so complicated. But I kind of love that. It challenges me to sometimes step into other people's shoes and not just quickly pass judgment.
Yeah,
I will say there's a movie that I would recommend. It was made in 1970. It came out.
Okay.
It stars Alec Guinness, so Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah.
Who plays Charles I.
Oh, shoot. Okay.
And he does a fantastic job playing Charles I.
Okay.
So if you want to see, if you've been interested in what we've been talking about, or if you like Obi-Wan Kenobi and want to see him playing Charles I, it's fantastic. It's a great movie. And it's called Oliver Cromwell.
Oh, nice. Okay. All right.
Yeah, it's a bit more sympathetic to Oliver Cromwell. It makes Charles I look pretty bad, but I think a lot of it he kind of has coming. So
okay, all right, that sounds good. Sounds like we need a remake of that movie. That's a little bit more Anglican sympathetic. That sounds like that should be in the works. I'm not sure how many studios are looking to put out Christian historical period pieces, but I'd watch it. I'd watch it in theaters. Yeah,
for sure. There's plenty of good battles, and it's really about the Civil War, English Civil War as well. So it covers a lot of different things. So
very cool.
Yeah.
Dang. Well, Ben, dude, you've been a great tour guide through history for us this evening. You came with the heat, man. You brought a lot of background. You kind of walked us through the centuries to get us into the war, and I feel like I feel both more critical and sympathetic of Charles I, which I think is all I could ask for, because like you said, one thing that I love about church history is I've even been thinking about this since we did our episode on Anthony a few days ago, who we mostly get our record from out of these like hagiographies, is like there's something so special about grounding these individuals into the times and places that they lived and trying to be like, okay, yes, this was part of their life, but how did these external factors also influence that? How did culture influence that? How did that kind of set things up? So, but yeah, dude, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and thanks for your time, man.
Yeah. When you invited me and I said, what are we talking about? And you said, how about Charles I? I knew this was going to be quite an interesting discussion. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for letting me talk so much.
No, dude, sure the more you talk, the more I enjoy it. I just want to, I feel like I'm listening to a podcast as we're creating a podcast, which is great. So guys, if you've fallen in love with Ben Lansing as you should, please look him up on ourchurchspeaks.com for his artwork. Our Church Speaks on Instagram. Certainly look up his podcast, also called Our Church Speaks. That's consistent branding, you guys. You love to see it. Yeah. Also, feel free to follow us wherever you're listening to your podcasts, and leave us a review if you can. That would be great. Help other people find our show. Thank you guys so much for listening. We love you all.
Oh, and grab an Our Church Speaks book while you're at it.
Yeah, which you can get on Amazon, right?
You can get it anywhere, yeah.
Wherever books are found. All right, well, Thank you, listener. We appreciate you guys, and we will talk to you real soon.
Thanks so much.